Hi Luke, this is Ira, and I'm recording here my audio feedback on your Literacies of Struggle essay. I really enjoyed reading this essay. I think you thought about it in really smart and interesting ways. And so my feedback here isn't really so much evaluative of this essay per se, as it is a series of responses to the essay as it's currently laid out that I hope will be helpful as you're working through the final moments of the final project. So really what I'm kind of going to do in this feedback is reflect back to you some of the moments that I think were particularly finely crafted or really smart or interesting connections that you're making, and then also reflect back some of the spots where I want to push you a little further or encourage you to think about the connections between things differently or in another way that might be interesting or useful as well. So and I'll also probably make just a couple comments along the way that are just sort of general writing suggestions, things you might keep in mind for further papers. But again, this is really with an eye to helping you think about what you're up to in the final project for the class and what it means really to explain the particular literacy of struggles associated with no DAPL to outside audiences. Okay, so right off the bat, so you give us this nice, you kind of bring us into thinking about literacy as understanding based on teaching, and then you offer this quick, clean definition. Literacies of struggle are the understanding of the challenges faced by the oppressed. So they're about understanding the challenges that oppressed people face. The purpose of these literacies is to build sympathy for those who are oppressed and to inform the privileged how they might be unknowingly supporting these inequalities and how they might better recognize this oppression in order to ally with the oppressed. And so the vision here is starting off, and I know you talk about this again later and kind of switch it up a little bit, I think, smartly. But this vision starting off is this vision of essentially literacies of struggle are addressed to outside communities relative to struggle. They're addressed to people who may become allies. And the goal is to build sympathy, inform the privileged, and foster their allying with the oppressed. So we're starting off with that sense of literacies of struggle as being for oppressors in some way. And it makes sense that, starting with Brandt and thinking about sponsors of literacy and the way that she talks about literacy as being heavily influenced by social standing and race, and also being oriented towards sponsors, right? Understanding is based around what our sponsors want us to know. I think it makes sense that you end up thinking about literacies of struggle as essentially how movements come to serve as literacy sponsors for privileged people, which is cool. Actually, it's a really genuinely interesting perspective. I think it's important that you broaden it out later in the way that you do, but I think it's a smart and interesting starting place. And it's a particularly nice line when you say literacies of struggle are an attempt to break the cycle of sponsors being the only the powerful teaching the privileged to accept things as they are. It's a really nice way of thinking about what's at stake. It's about breaking a certain kind of cycle. And then you raise, I think, an important question for this. What is needed to teach those who have enjoyed privilege all their lives about the struggles of the oppressed? And that brings you usefully to Krista Ratcliffe's work, since, of course, that is an important part of, as you know, what she's looking at and trying to understand. I think you could here have done a little bit more with Ratcliffe, quote a little bit from the work and get a little deeper into the text. So as a reader, that's something I would be kind of looking for here, is a little deeper engagement with the text. What exactly are we getting out of this text? Why is it useful? What does she bring to the table in helping us think about literacies of struggle exactly? you, I mean, you do obviously are talking about this in a general way and in a way that makes sense, but how about at the level of like specifically textually, what are you getting out of what she's saying? I think you do that quite well in the case of Visner, right? So you're looking at Ishi and what it means for him to live among the white people as a way of practicing survivance, and I think that's a really useful. Much by contrast with the way that you're reading Ratcliffe, your reading of Visner is much more in the text, and you trace that out really nicely here. Now, before here as a reader, I would find myself thus survivance reframes the continued existence of Native American culture as a show of strength and promise of continuation, and I think that's a strong reading of Visner, dead on. And then we kind of jump to Ansaldúa. How to Tame a Wild Tongue from Gloria Ansaldua's book, Borderlands, La Frontera, provides a very simple example of how the privileged classes in both Mexico and the United States can assist in eliminating some level of oppression. And that's, I mean, also a solid summary of what's happening in that essay. But we're, at the level of transition, we're just kind of jumping from A to B. And I want to suggest that, and again, this is not something you should have done differently. You did a great job on this. I was quite happy with how it turned out. But also, this is something that I think you should keep in mind the next time, the next piece of writing you're working on. When you find yourself jumping from A to B, which is kind of what happens here, it just sort of moves on to the next thing. One really good way to build a transition is to go back to the organizing idea. And so here you say, survivance reframes the continued existence of Native American culture as a show of strength and promise of continuation. And so here as a writer, it would be interesting to hear you return to the notion that literacies of struggle are this kind of project for teaching the privileged to be able to see and empathize with and take seriously the experience of the oppressed, by drawing this out and explaining, well, what does that mean for literacies of struggle? What does survivance do for the concept of literacies of struggle? And what's the relation between what that does for the concept of literacies of struggle and what Ansaldúa does? So in other words, I'd encourage you in moments like this to build the transition by going back to the organizing idea, to the thesis, or in this paper to the specific definition, and looking at how each of the two different things to be tied together. Here, that's Visner with survivance and Ansaldúa with the work that's available to the privileged. Talk about how each of those things brings to light some aspect or another that ties them together of the organizing definition. And this is just a small thing. If you're going to do a block quote, you want to do it all indented and then follow it by picking back up the paragraph like so. And I would also say in general, and this is another just kind of general principle of writing, block quotes can be really powerful, and I think this is a particularly powerful moment in Ansaldúa's text, so I think you've chosen well there. But also, if you're going to quote at length, it's almost always important to follow up with some kind of more substantive, fuller engagement. So what exactly, so you say this encapsulates the allying portion of literacies of struggle, and that's useful, right? The best way to support the oppressed is to legitimize their way of life, and the best way to do so is by not demanding they conform. So there's a kind of a simple set of possibilities, which is really fair enough. But then we kind of drop off a cliff there. How does this tie into the other things that came before? What about the specific way that Ansaldúa talks about this? How does that work? In other words, how is that rhetorically powerful or effective for the audience that you see her speaking to? So in other words, this is a good example of a spot where it's a well-chosen block quote, and you're following it up in a perfectly reasonable way, but to really get the most out of that block quote, you want to get into the actual text and be looking at how it's written, why this particular wording is effective here, and tie that a little more fully back up to the organizing idea. You do talk about it as part of the allying portion, but help us see at this point, how are these different texts we've been looking at all connected or related? What's the pattern that ties them all together and makes them all pieces of literacies of struggle as you're defining it? Now, all that said, one of the things I thought you did extremely well in this literacies of struggle paper is to use the no DAPL rhetoric that you were looking at as a test. I mean, I think you really tested your definition, and you did that very effectively. And you sort of looked at how and why the different rhetorical artifacts both did and did not fit with what your theory would have had you expect. So that was really, in terms of like theory testing by studying an artifacts, or studying artifacts, I think you did a really good job with that. And you know, for instance, when you say, you're talking about the NCAI report, you say the document discusses goals and outcomes for the community and is less concerned with convincing outsiders to sympathize with or support them. And then you also note, it is true, there's perhaps a small appeal to outsiders that might read the document here. So you're pressing beyond your own original definition by studying the artifact, and at the same time you're exploring the ways in which the artifact does fit with what your definition would have you expect. And I think that's a really nuanced, really strong way to use an artifact to test a theory. So I just want to kind of applaud that. That's something that's working really well there. You know, and as you say at the end, all these are reasonable requests, and any privileged outsiders should feel particularly sympathetic toward the idea of ensuring promises made by the government are kept. Still, this document does not serve as a strong supporting example of the theory. And then you look at the essays on Mujeres Talk to see by contrast what it looks like for movement rhetoric to more strongly support the theory or fit more closely with what the theory would expect, which I think you also did really effectively. But here, one thing I would have wanted to see maybe more of is, besides the fact that if we're going to quote this long, it should again be probably a block quote, right? So you do like this, hard enter, and then hard enter at the end, back, and then you just tab in, and the whole thing, if you're using a PC with Microsoft Word, will all automatically become a block quote. So here, if we're going to get these worst scenes imaginable from law enforcement, and I think that's really important, you're pointing to something that's exactly part of how this sort of movement rhetoric works, how it's effective, then we want to follow up and say, okay, so cool, how is that working? When you say it's building sympathy, how is that related to these parts of the essay? What's exactly happening when Duarte is showing the excesses or the violences, the harms of law enforcement in their responses to the protesters? Who is she addressing, and how exactly is she addressing those audiences? You know, and I think, so then just kind of moving forward, one of the things that you said here that I think was really smart, is a very insightful realization, is that neither essay is all that interested in stating or even arguing for the idea that a reader who is not already affected by these events might be tacitly supporting them. So in other words, I think you're smart to realize that a lot of movement rhetoric is really directed towards people who are already, to some extent at least, taking an interest in the movement, rather than towards persuading those who are totally outside the ambit, who don't already see themselves as allies or aren't already participants. And so one of the things that I think would be really interesting, and you get to this a little bit in conclusion, but not yet as much as I think you can, and I think it would be interesting just as you're moving into the final moments. You don't have to write about this in the final project. I'm just sort of encouraging you to think about it. Is what's the relationship within literacies of struggle between the parts of the rhetoric that's directed to outsiders and the parts of the rhetoric that's directed to insiders? How do those fit together? And what does it mean if literacies of struggle can contain both? How does that affect the definition? In closing, you note that the theory did not fit as well as hoped. This is, I think, just to repeat myself, I think you take a very salutary attitude towards using the examples to test the theory. That's excellent. I strongly encourage you to keep doing that. That's in terms of like trying to understand things about the world. That method is really powerful, even in the humanities. It's not only powerful in the sciences or social sciences. And I think that's sort of demonstrated by how effectively you've done that to realize that you had, as you say, an overly narrow definition that left out at least half the potential audiences of any rhetorical work, those who already understand and agree somewhat with the writer. And so your wording, as you know, originally wrongly or maybe insufficiently assumed that literacies of struggle would focus merely on educating those outside the hardships faced by an oppressed group. But in fact, it's important to continue educating the oppressed as well. So that literacies of struggle, you're still focusing, by the way, on literacies as being about education. And I don't have a problem with that. I think it's perfectly reasonable. But also, I think it's like it may be an interesting place to challenge your own thinking a little bit. Are literacies of struggle mostly about education, just about education, sometimes about education, but also about other things? Why education? What's the role of education in literacies of struggle? And this might be somewhere you could think back through Brandt a little bit more and think about what's at stake when you're saying that literacies of struggle, in effect, function as literacy sponsors. Kind of tease out the implications of that a little bit more. I think it'd be kind of interesting. And then you offered the new definition. Literacies of struggle are the understandings of the struggles faced by the oppressed. They exist in order to garner support for the oppressed, help the oppressed continue to work toward equality, and to educate those both inside and outside this oppression in ways that might be combated or felt differently by different people. And that is I think that's a really nicely reworked version of the theory. I think that's, you really used this exercise well to drive your own thinking in a fuller way. So that's fantastic. And I want to highlight, this kind of leaves us still with the question of, okay, cool, but so why education? How does this fit back in with Brandt? How does rhetorical listening fit into this picture if we're thinking partly with Ratcliffe? Is survivance always part of a literacy of struggle, or only sometimes, to kind of bring us back to Wisner? And in terms of Ansaldua, who bears the most responsibility for the languages that are at stake in literacies of struggle? So those are just, some questions that I don't think you should or could reasonably have answered within the ambit of that assignment. So I'm not offering them as things you failed to do. Instead, they're questions that I hope will be kind of interesting for you to kind of keep thinking about. As you're moving through the final project and you're thinking about what you're doing there and what we've been up to as a class, why you're doing this, what matters here, what's at stake in the work, I encourage you to keep thinking about what literacies of struggle are and how the different elements that you've identified as important fit together and why. So thanks for your work this semester, and thanks for your great work on this essay. I'm looking forward to reading your argument soon. And obviously, if you want to meet with me, send me an email ahead of time. Happy to meet Monday or Tuesday next week. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you soon. or reading your work soon. Thanks.